So here we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm going to wait about 30 seconds to a minute to let everyone join in. Please make sure that you are muted, and we'll get started very soon. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hi, everyone. I am Russell Daniels. I am the Digital Communications Director at Open Primaries. We're so excited to have everyone on today's call. This is our final virtual discussion of the summer. And we're really excited for this group and this panel today. Before I turn things over to John Opdyke, the President of Open Primaries, just want to make two quick announcements. Please make sure that you are muted during the discussion. With so many people being on the call, we just want to make sure everyone is clear. And also, we will be having a Q&A in about half an hour. So if you have a question during the call, please put your name, your state, and a brief summary of your call in the chat, and we will get to as many questions as we can during today's Q&A session. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Open Primaries President John Opdyke. John, take it away.
Thank you, Russ. Welcome, everybody. Very excited about the conversation we're going to have today. Before we dive in, I want to introduce you to my co-host, Danny Ortega. Danny and I met in 2015 when we began working together to put an open primaries referendum on the ballot in Arizona. We both still have the scars from that experience. The campaign didn't work out, but we've continued to work together to push the issue of full voter empowerment forward in both Arizona and across the country. Danny is an attorney, he's an activist, and he's one of the most principled and thoughtful political advocates I've ever had the privilege of working with. So say hello, Danny.
Hello, good morning in Arizona. To most of you back east, it's noon, so hello.
So Danny and I are joined today by Cecilia Bailly and Michael Powell, who are the founders of Culture Concepts, a very innovative research firm based in Texas. Both Cecilia and Michael are anthropologists, trained anthropologists, and they do research, political research, that is very different and much more in depth than most of the research and polling that's out there in the political realm. Last September, after 18 months of research, they released a report entitled Understanding Texas Latino Voters Through Meaningful Conversation. I've read through it about 3 times, and every time I get something new from it. And I know Danny and I have a bunch of questions, and I'm sure our audience do as well. But before we dive into the specific report, Michael and Cecilia, tell us about this project. How did it come about? What's the backstory of this report?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us, John and Danny. We're very excited to be in dialogue with a different kind of audience than we've been presenting the report to. We've presented the report to a number of organizations here in Texas, to some progressive left-leaning groups, because the client that funded the project, it's a nonpartisan study, but the organization mobilizes Black and Latino and working class voters in Texas. So they've got their audiences that we presented the report to. We've spoken to some Latino leaders and political experts, but this is a different audience that we're very excited to dialogue with about this question of partisanship in particular, which we believe is one of the most interesting findings of this study. But the way the study came about is I have been following media narratives. I'm a journalist as well. I'm a magazine writer, and I've followed media narratives about Latino voter turnout. And it seemed to me that every election, there'd be stories before the election saying that this is the election where Latinos are going to make the difference in the outcome. And then after the election, some story about how they didn't turn out in their full proportion. And there's some disappointment and conversation about why. I never was satisfied with the explanations. You know, a few experts would be quoted about why turnout is low. And I felt like we needed a deeper understanding, a deeper explanation. In particular, I am very, biased in favor of anthropology in the sense that, you know, as anthropologists, one of the very basic lessons we learned right at the beginning when we start our studies is about cultural relativism and this idea that different people make sense of the world differently based on their social and cultural environment. And you can't impose your own ways of thinking and your own language and categories on other people. You have to understand, you have to start with a blank slate as much as possible and try to understand how people themselves are making sense of the world. And so I felt that this was the approach we needed to understand voting, because voting is not just a political action or behavior. And that's one of the big takeaways from the study. It reminds us that voting is social behavior, it's cultural behavior. So I ended up talking to Michelle Tremillo, who's the director of Texas Organizing Project, a group in Texas that, as I mentioned, mobilizes voters. After the 2018 election here, which is, you may have heard of it, when Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke were competing for the Senate seat, and Beto came very close to winning the seat. I asked her afterwards, what did you learn about Latinos and their voting when you went around knocking on doors? And she said, I feel like we have more questions than answers. So that was the beginning of a conversation that led to some fundraising that led to this study. And it was a 1.5-year study. We spoke with 104 Latino voters and non-voters in 5 different regions of Texas. And about 1/4 of the people we spoke with were non-voters. The other 3/4 were spread, you know, Republican, Independent, Democrats, and just people who had no affiliation. I think there's some folks who assertively say that they're independent, and there's others who just don't associate with any party, but they're not necessarily saying they're independent, right? So these were long conversations, one-on-one conversations. We felt even focus groups were not going to serve our purpose. We were going back to the beginning and having conversations with people, not just about their views about a particular political issue, but how they relate to voting, how they relate to government. We asked things like, do you believe that government can make your life better? We were trying to see how they make sense of their place in the political system and the political world in this country. And they were very moving conversations. People cried with us, men and women alike. I think there were more men probably that shed tears than women in our conversations. And that's to show you just the kind of intimacy that exchange allowed, and how closely politics are related to the things that people struggle with in their lives and dream for in their lives. And we were going there with these folks. We weren't polling them, we were getting to know them intimately. And so I feel that the results were very rich. I'd love for Michael to make a few comments about what it is about our methodology that allows us to have a different kind of findings.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for having me here. Thank you, Cecilia. Cecilia is really the kind of the visionary here of the project, in that she's been studying related issues, but neither of us are really voting experts. And especially me, I come from more of a consulting background, studying things like brands and consumer culture. Which was interesting to me, the relationship between brands and the political parties. I would call this a kind of case of low brand loyalty. We, like Cecilia said, we took a different approach, and we used this ethnographic qualitative research approach, which I think is really powerful for situations like this, where there are so many theories out there about partisanship, how it works, where it's coming from. And during the course of the project, just and there's a lot of other facets that we looked at, but in terms of partisanship, I, in my literature review, saw at least 12, maybe up to 20 different kind of theoretical directions that try to explain partisanship and why partisanship is happening. And none of them, after we had talked with 100 people, seemed satisfactory, that people were not fitting neatly into any of the theories or into any of the polling. And, as we were studying the popular narratives, the public narratives in journalism, in the media, things didn't really add up. And so that's why the anthropological perspective was so powerful and meaningful for this report, that we could uncover the personal stories and really get into kind of the deep, meaningful aspects of what drives people to vote or not, and who they're going to vote for and why or why not. And that sort of storytelling component that really teased out the meaningful aspects of people's lives, I think is what distinguishes this study in a lot of meaningful ways.
And I should say just quickly that I have reason to believe that the findings reflect the nature of Latino voters nationally, because very little of it was focused on issues that are particular to Texas. So we would love to keep doing work in other states, but I think, the report has the name Texas on it because that's where it happened. But I think people throughout the country would probably recognize some elements of the findings and can take something from it.
Great. Danny, you have a question?
Yeah, Cecilia, something in your report interested me, and that is the fact that when you talk to people, the thing they told you most was that politicians never contact them. Number one, and number two, very similar sort of complaints here in Arizona. That's for some reason or another, politicians don't contact them. They say, look, we hear that there are people who are receiving phone calls, there are people who are getting mail, there are people who they're showing up at their door. We hear about this all the time, and they encourage us to vote, but nobody contacts us. Why do you think that's so? Stan, what did the study show about why it is that A, people feel they're not being contacted, and B, why not?
Yeah. Well, there's a really big structural problem that drives that. And that is that in the American political system, the way you win an election is by getting 50% of the voters plus one, right? And so the way campaigns work is they purchase data on who's voted in the past. And those are the people that they do outreach to. They reason that it's safest to just do outreach if you have limited budget and time, or at least budget. You reach out to the people that have voted in the past and try to get them on your side. And so based on that system, nobody's reaching out to non-voters, right? And it's a self-perpetuating system. And it also means that, I lost my train of thought, but other people are not hearing and not meeting candidates. And we saw that makes a big difference. Is if you have met a candidate in person, politics seems a little more relatable, a little closer to you. Most of the folks we met, a lot of them had not met any candidates. And so they're constantly being excluded from the conversation. But then the popular thinking is people will say, well, if they don't vote, candidates are not going to reach out to them, right? But if they're never being engaged, then they're not going to vote. And so it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where no one is putting in the time or money to dialogue with non-voters or with some of the low frequency voters. But more broadly than that, I think, what I took away, I didn't put this particular argument in the study, but I've been studying Latino issues for a long, long time, more than 20 years as a researcher and as a journalist. And I think that Americans don't know what to do with us as Latinos very well, don't know how to make sense of us, We saw that, for instance, this year, in the Democratic Party, we had a Latino candidate who ran for president, Julian Castro. And regardless of what you think his quality as a candidate, his strengths and weaknesses, you could tell from the media narratives and the debates that no one knew sort of what to make of him and where to put him. And I have this thinking that, in a lot of states in this country, the Latino population is newer. And there's a tendency to think of Latinos, this is my view now, but based on years of experience on the ground, we have a tendency to think of Latinos only as immigrants and as outsiders. And because we're always getting new immigration, Latinos are always seen as foreigners. And I don't think we think of Latinos as Americans and as, people, ethnic minorities, people of color, but American citizens who are voting. And so I think we exist in this kind of nebulous space, if you will. And that came through in the interviews, where I'll get into that a little later, but when we talk about Latino sense of belonging, where they're kind of making sense of where do I fit in the political system. I mean, we see that Latinos are absent from, we're the fastest growing non-white group nationally. In Texas this year, we're expected to become the largest ethnic group. In California, they're already the biggest ethnic group, but we're absent from media. Media commentators are typically not Latino. And so I think for me, and again, that's a personal view, is that we're still making sense of who Latinos are and where to fit them and how to understand them.
Something related to that, I've noticed over the last 10, 15 years, and it seems to be picking up steam, that there is a framework or a paradigm, roughly speaking, called demographics are destiny. That as the country becomes more brown, more black, more people of color, that will automatically translate into gains for the Democratic Party. And your report seems to suggest otherwise. How do you go up against, or how do you think about the whole demographics or destiny argument? Because it seems so prevalent. It seems so big in the kind of intellectual research, political punditry world. What do you think about it? Is it a big problem?
I think we're just beginning to understand, or not even understand, but just witness the great variety of political views among Latinos. And with this study, I can tell you the first 20 interviews, we did them in Houston. And after those 20 interviews, there were 3 of us on the research team. We were kind of freaked out because we were thinking, what are we going to be able to say, generalize about Latino voters? Every one of the 20 people we spoke with had somewhat different views of different issues. So, we cannot generalize at all. But what we did begin to see after more than 20 interviews was recurring themes in the way Latinos related to voting and to the political system. But I think that idea that demographics are destiny, that argument has assumed that Latinos will behave politically similar to the Black community. And I think it's predicated on the notion that these notions around race and class and how that shapes your political leaning. So specifically, that if you're a person of color and you tend to be working class, lower middle class, that you're automatically going to lean left and you're going to vote for the Democratic Party. We ended up seeing a big variety. I mean, it continues to be true that about 2/3 of Latinos vote Democrat. I don't know that will change significantly right away in terms of broad numbers, but those categories are in flux, right? So for instance, I've been doing interviews with Trump supporters in South Texas. That is the region that registered the biggest shift towards, from 2016 to 2020, the biggest gains for President Trump happened along the South Texas border. And so I've been doing interviews down there, and there you see working class folks, lower middle class folks, who would tell us, well, the old Republican Party here in Texas, we would say, what did the Republican Party mean to you? What did the Democratic Party mean to you? And they would say, well, the Republican Party, my parents told me growing up that it was for wealthy white voters, or Anglo voters, as we say in Texas. And now they don't see it as a party that's only for wealthy people. And so how the parties get defined, that is shifting. But the other thing is that we found a great degree of what we call fluidity or hybridity in the way people determine their political values. And so what do we mean by that? We said in the study that partisanship is low or weak among Latinos. What we mean by that is we didn't hear people speaking very strongly about party platforms. There were, for everything I say, there's an exception. So there were people sort of very strongly identified with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They tend to be people sort of with higher levels of education sometimes, or they're more politically active. But the vast majority of people did not articulate sort of what the platform stood for beyond general notions of what kind of people affiliate with Democrats or Republicans. They weren't, they were making sense of issues sort of in a complex way, where on some issues they would express ideas that sounded more like Democrats leaning. Other views on other issues, you could classify them as Republican. Even among people who consistently voted for one party, especially on the left with the Democratic Party, we heard a little more of sort of ideological stances on the right with Republicans, with consistent Republican voters. But even with some people who vote consistently Democrat, they would assert that they vote based on candidate and not on party. And that or else they would say, but I don't want to be too extreme and not be closed off to another idea. And that doesn't mean that they're just moderate. That's another thing that gets said a lot about Latino voters, that they're simply moderate. Someone can be very sort of what we would consider far left on one issue and then more moderate or far right on another issue. So we started thinking about what are some of those reasons for the low partisanship. There's different reasons for different people. One is, like I mentioned, that their views are kind of hybrid and mixed. And it's possible that all American voters actually see issues this way, in a complex way. We just haven't done these kinds of conversations and studies with them. Number two is that a lot of Latino voters are new voters. Their parents were not voters, either because they're children of immigrants or else they're third, fourth generation, but their parents were not voting. And so they don't have an intergenerational allegiance where my family has always voted this way, therefore I'm going to be more likely to vote, left or right. And then a third reason is that the parties have not made a big effort, either one, to form a relationship and an ongoing dialogue with Latinos. The sense with Latino voters is that the parties come around right at election time, they do some Spanish language media, maybe they throw out an immigration proposal, and they expect to get Latino voters that way. So there isn't the kind of relationship, for instance, that you see with the Black community, where the party is in conversation with Black leaders throughout the year and trying to form those alliances and allegiances. And number four is we did hear some younger voters. They tended to be sort of very progressive voters who are no longer considering themselves Republican or Democrat, Democrat in particular. They tend to vote for Democratic candidates, but they feel that the two-party system has failed and is not properly representing everyone's interests. But it was interesting in the recruiting that we were trying to get certain numbers of Republicans and Democrats to interview. And what we kept getting was a bunch of people who wanted to participate who didn't claim any affiliation. So that was a big key to us, that there's a lot of people out there that want to talk about politics and are interested, but they haven't defined what party they really belong to.
Cecilia, connected to the first question that I asked you, is the fact that whenever Democrats lose, it's because Latinos didn't get out the vote. Okay, always. That is by the way, I believe that there is many white voters who are not contacted who act like Latino voters. They don't get out the vote. Okay, I don't think that the racial line is different. If you don't contact somebody, irrespective of their color or their gender, they're not going to be interested in voting. But because this is about Latinos and the fact that we are being criticized because we don't get out in the numbers that people feel they should be getting out on, it seems to me very unfair. Your first answer was, well, they're not contacted, and if they're not contacted, they're not going to get out to vote. How do we deal with politicians who don't understand that the lack of contact? By the way, I also believe that Latino candidates don't get Latinos out to vote because Latino candidates don't contact them either. So how do we deal with the idea that you don't have to go deep into ideology to try to figure it out? It's very simple. You didn't contact them. Why do you think people don't see this?
Yeah, and that's interesting you said that. You know, some of the lowest levels of voter turnout in Texas are in strongly Democratic areas with Latino leaders, for instance, San Antonio or South Texas. I'm not saying it's just a problem with the Democratic Party, but just having a Latino representative is not enough to actually increase the number of people participating. Well, first, to backtrack a little bit before we ask what politicians need to know or do, is that, you know, the common assumption out there is that Latinos don't care about politics. And I even hear that from my peers, my Latino friends and peers, who say our people don't care. You know, they're very disillusioned after an election when they see the voter turnout. We expected to, you know, we wanted to see even the study that would show up. On the contrary, we did not find people to be apathetic. We actually, like almost all of the people we spoke with, were following political news to some degree. Not 100% of them, but the vast majority could speak to some degree to what was going on, especially in national politics, which is what gets the most media coverage. They knew who Nancy Pelosi was. They, you know, were following the debates over Trump. And so what we discovered is these are not voters that don't have information or don't care about politics. What I like to say now is more that they're following politics from the sidelines. So they're following politics, but they're not voting. So why not? Well, the people who don't vote, the most common expression is that they don't believe their vote matters. And, you know, if you just take it on the surface, people get frustrated with that. Well, of course it matters. Since you learn in government class that everybody's vote makes a difference. But when you see their other, why they believe that or where that comes from. One, they don't feel that people in the political system are representing interests, their interests. They don't feel that politicians, especially, this comes up a lot with working class folks or people living in poverty. They have a sense that, you know, candidates don't have any idea how they live and they're not speaking to them and they're not trying to get their vote or engage them. Number two is, you know, some of them, especially people living in those lower classes, which is what a lot of the potential eligible Latino voters are, working class, lower middle class. They also in their communities haven't seen, some of them, if they're living in poor communities, they haven't seen change in their communities. They haven't been able to tie specific leadership and specific candidates and elected officials to some improvement in their life. And then they haven't seen their parents voting. So another thing that we discovered in this study, well, we didn't discover it, it's been put out there, but it hasn't been talked about enough, is that voting is what we call a social habit. It's not a rational choice. We talk about voting, it's not only a rational choice. We tend to talk about voting as it's people sit on their couch and decide whether their vote matters and what's in their best interest, and they get up and go vote. Voting is like any other social behavior where if you see people doing it, you learn to do it. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. And eventually you're voting so regularly that if it's election day and you haven't gone out to vote, some part of you feels like something's wrong, right? And probably most of you can identify with that, can associate with that. That's how you can explain. We spoke with a young woman who had been active in a political campaign and she wasn't voting. So she knew the importance of voting in broader terms, but it hadn't become a part of her behavior. So we also talk about the importance of building like communities of voting, habits of voting among people. None of the non-voters that we spoke with had grown up seeing a parent vote. The strongest predictor of whether you will vote is whether you grew up seeing your parents vote. And then it just becomes a natural ingrained idea that your vote matters. So all of this is explaining sort of on the surface that simple expression of my vote doesn't matter. It's actually like embedded in a lot of experiences beyond voting where folks don't feel that they have agency or that they are the ones who make decisions. You know, other people expressed it in this broad way of like, other folks are the ones who make the decisions. And then the electoral college for some of them doesn't help, especially in a state like Texas, where they assume like, you know, they've heard that the state is going to go Republican, you know, most likely, even if they vote Democrats, and then they're less encouraged to vote. So that's a long answer, but it's because it's very layered, Danny. This question of why people don't feel that their vote matters. It's got many layers to it. So what do politicians need to do? I think they need to understand this. I think, we need to have people in power that care about more than winning an election, that care about having, as many people participate in government in order to make it a truly representative government. I don't know, I feel a little bit cynical about whether candidates are the ones who are going to do that. I think it's going to be other actors. I think it's going to be groups like TOP, that we worked with, groups like yours, other folks who are invested in that, in increasing the level of participation. And even other actors can participate, like cultural institutions that have nothing to do with politics can promote civic engagement within their activities. So it's a multi-pronged strategy where many people have to play a role. Educational institutions have to play a better role. Our civics education is really poor, not just in Texas, nationally.
Yeah. All right, we're going to open it up for Q&A. We have a question from Ian Haney Lopez. Just a quick reminder, if you have a question, go into the chat, type your name and your state, and just a one-sentence summary of what you want to ask, and then I'll call on you, or Danny will call on you, and we'll go from there. But our first question comes from Ian Haney Lopez. Where are you from?
I'm out in Richmond, California.
Great. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Delighted to dig into this report. I've had a chance just to go through the summary really quickly. I guess in my research with Latino voters, the number one determinant of partisanship was their orientation towards race. So there was this, some people understood Latinos to be joining the American mainstream, similar to European immigrant groups. Others understood Latinos to be likely to remain distinct from the mainstream, similar to African Americans. Others thought that race was something that would not constrain them overly much, that they could get ahead over generations simply through hard work, right? These sort of big questions about where Latinos as a whole fit in a racially hierarchically organized society, in a context in which a lot of our political discourse reinforces the idea of a racial hierarchy. And so, it's a very, did you find something similar? Did you talk to people about race? Did you talk to people about where they saw Latinos within a sort of a racial context, how they saw race operating in politics? I'm very interested in any insights along those lines.
Sure, and I'll say that I'm a big fan of Ian's work. He's been dedicated to this subject for a long time. This question of race, I would love to keep looking at in Texas. It's very complex with Latinos. In fact, one of the things I ask myself in looking at that aspect is if Latinos are expected to behave sort of like Black voters, right? And is there a sense of a common ethnic identity among Latinos, and that translates to a common ethnic political agenda? And what we found was that people were experiencing their ethnicity. But what I mean by that is, we asked people, have you ever been discriminated against? Have you been made to feel different? And almost everybody had a story about that. Even, quote unquote, white passing Latinos. There's these conversations now about skin color and how much that determines how you experience race. No doubt that skin tone privileges certain people over others, but we had like 2 Latinos that were, light skin, colored eyes, green blue eyes, males, who told us the police will never mistake me for a white man, or white individuals don't mistake me for a white person, right? And so we found that people were not living independently of their ethnicity. They were experiencing it, but they weren't talking about it in these articulate terms about race and ethnicity and where they belong in that hierarchy. In fact, that's where we said earlier that Latinos exist in this kind of nebulous space where, especially here in Texas, we have a long history of racial discrimination and exclusion of Latinos, including death, including lynchings and state executions, the extrajudicial execution of Mexicans in the early 19th century. Folks were not referencing that history. We don't teach that history in schools. Regardless of how you feel about whether it should be taught, that's a conversation that's become super politicized. But the fact that we haven't acknowledged that history, I believe, leaves people sort of not having a shared memory, a shared reference to the same degree that Black voters do, for instance. There is a civil rights movement in Texas. Danny knows that. He was part of La Raza Unida. That party exists in Texas. Folks were not talking about that. Folks were not talking about Latinos fighting for the right to vote. Also on the question of race, Latinos for a long time, have been classified as white on paper. And there was one person who put it beautifully. He said, he was very dark skinned, and he pointed that out, and he said, he grew up with a very left-leaning grandmother in the west side of San Antonio, the barrio of San Antonio. And he said, my birth certificate says I'm white, and my grandmother told me you're Mexican-American. And I thought that beautifully captured this strange in-between space that Texas Latinos inhabit in terms of race and ethnicity. I push back against this easy notion that some folks on the left have, that you hear sometimes this discourse that Latinos who vote Republican are simply trying to be white. Interestingly, with the Trump supporters in particular in the Rio Grande Valley, I've been doing those interviews the past few months. Ethnic pride is really strong with them, cultural pride. They're people with a very strong sense of both Mexican and Tejano. Some of them are immigrants, some of them are third generation. They're very rooted in their culture and ethnicity. So I don't have a theory yet, Ian. It's more like what I saw on the ground was far more complex. I didn't think that it fit with these discourses and these explanations we're hearing right now nationally. And so I actually would love to continue in conversation with you about this.
That's
it's a long
fascinating.
answer, sorry, but it's a very big question.
Wow. Could do a whole Zoom call on that. We have a question from Harry Kresge in New York. Go ahead, Harry.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you, Harry.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for this very interesting dialogue. In New York, at least downstate, when you think of Latinos, you think of Puerto Rican, Dominican, etc. In Florida, I assume that the Cuban population makes up a significant percentage of Latino voters. To what extent do these issues or these categories come into play when trying to analyze Latinos as a voting bloc or analyze how Latinos vote?
Yeah, this is where I'll admit we just don't have enough to compare. In our recruitment, we drew some non-Mexicans. There's a term the Border Patrol uses. I'm from the border and I study border enforcement along. They have this term OTMs, other than Mexicans. They classify all immigrants as either Mexican or other than Mexican. So sometimes that comes to mind in a kind of sarcastic way. But in Houston and Dallas, we did get a few more Central American, South American voters. In San Antonio, El Paso, and South Texas, it was mostly Mexican, Mexican-American. So I just don't feel that I spoke to enough people to be able to make generalizations across different nationalities or ethnicities. But there's no doubt that the quantitative data shows differences, and Ian can probably speak a lot better to that question of Puerto Rican and Dominican, for instance, versus Cuban versus Mexican, Mexican-American. What I have come to say now from this study, though, is that we tend to think that the diversity of Latino political opinion is mostly related to nationality and what country you or your parents or your ancestors were from. I think the biggest diversity of political opinion that you find is among working class, lower middle class Mexican Americans. And that includes children of immigrants, first generation, and that includes fourth generation in Texas. Arizona, the whole Southwest also had some of these Mexican Americans that are fourth, fifth generation. Within that group alone, controlling for class, controlling for ethnicity, controlling for geography or region, because they're all in San Antonio or they're all in El Paso, you just see this immense diversity of how people are positioning themselves. In terms of parties, yeah, they do still quantitatively lean more Democrat. As I said, anywhere from it tends to be on average sort of 2/3, right? But when you talk to them, the way that each of them is making sense of issues like immigration, like gun control, it's incredibly rich and diverse.
Great. We have a lot of questions
Thank
coming through here. We have Joe Garcia in Arizona, Julia Hemsworth in New York, and Joe and Mike Gang in Oregon. We're going to start with Joseph in Arizona, who has a question about independence in the Latino community. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, good morning. Sometimes I think people not voting is a indirect silent vote in itself, perhaps with an unhappiness with both candidates that are on the ballot put on by the two-party system. So I'm wondering if what you found, or what are your thoughts about Latino independents who are not aligned with either party, and also perhaps not enamored with either party's candidates or even positions, because what we've seen is, of course, the polarization, and not a lot getting done sometimes, either from the right or from the left. So what have you found out, or what do you know about Latino independents, and what can be done to get more independents voting?
I'd say that, with Latinos, the people who were independent, there wasn't an overwhelming number that were asserting their independence, political independence, as specifically as a critique of the two parties and the two-party system, if that makes sense. There was, as I mentioned, there's some younger voters or some very highly educated, politically active voters that are choosing that stance because they have a criticism of the two-party system in particular. Others that were independent were people with mixed views, right, on different issues. And then a lot more of them are what I was describing as they just haven't developed a strong partisan loyalty yet. Or perhaps they could if they were more engaged by one or the other party, or perhaps they would remain more independent or more in the middle. It's unclear. So it's more out of a lack of long-term experience with the parties and investment in the parties. I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question? It was, how could we get more independence?
Yeah, exactly. Like here in Arizona, a third of our electorate are independents. Yeah. Independents do not vote in the primaries, when often actually many races are determined in the primaries. And then they do show up in general elections, but usually the presidential election kind of take the midterms off. Yeah. So looking for more attention to get independent voters voting, because really because of the partisanship and the polarization, oftentimes independents can sway the election results one way or the other.
Yeah. There's a group called X Labs Research and X Labs that is doing work on Latino voters and is now arguing that Latinos are swing voters. Many Latinos are swing voters that should be engaged, and they don't use the word studied, but we should try to understand that part of the electorate as much as we are trying to understand swing white voters. There's reason to think, for instance, a number of the individuals in South Texas that voted for Trump in 2020, but not in 2016, a lot of them sound kind of like swing voters when you talk to them. Not all, but a lot of them. I'm not sure, you'd have to go to the quantitative data to find out, like, officially how many of Texas Latinos consider themselves independent. What I'll tell you is, for instance, in South Texas, the Democratic Party has been in control for a long time. The leaders for several generations now have been Latinos, have been Mexican Americans. And because of that lack of competition, the voters complained that candidates don't run on issues, they just kind of run on their name. You have people who are Republican, probably by nature, but they vote in the Democratic primary because they know that whoever wins for county judge is going to be Democrat. So if you want to have an effect on the outcome, you vote in the Democratic primary. And consequently, like, there isn't a firm understanding in South Texas of what either party stands for. And people are more fluid. And they'll say, well, this person's a Democrat, but he's really Republican, And so that's one place where I've seen that the lack of a conversation about what the parties stand for is probably one factor in why people are not voting in high numbers. They feel like many people, 8 out of 10 people that I interviewed in Brownsville, Texas, my hometown, compared local government elections to high school elections. It's all about the name, the picture, and who's more popular, you know? But sorry, I'm veering off a bit, but I think there's all these interesting ways in which partisanship on the ground is kind of very fluid. And so consequently, I think that also leads to why people don't have a strong affiliation, because they're not having a conversation about what either party stands for. Now, whether, you know, Texas should have open primaries, that's sort of beyond the scope of our study, but I'm just trying to shed light qualitatively on some of the conversations. The other thing too, I'll say, sorry, I'm going a bit long in my answers, but that some people, it's in the course of dialogue that they begin to define what they really are, right? So like we spoke, that individual I mentioned who had the birth certificate that said he was white, but he could never understand himself as white. He described himself as a Republican, and by the end of the conversation, all I was doing was asking questions of how he felt on different issues and follow-up questions. And he said, maybe I'm more independent. So I also think that partisan affiliation comes out in dialogue and engagement, and Latinos have not had conversations about this, have not had an opportunity to dialogue. And so it's also interesting how that can shift within a conversation.
It's really fascinating, the social, like the way you're talking about voting and politics and identity being socially created and through conversation and community. That's such not part of the national conversation. It's all just who won, who lost, how many votes did you get, you know, and that's it. It just seems to me a very important thing you're bringing to the conversation. I want to get to all the questions. We have Julia Hemsworth in New York. Go ahead, Julia.
Hi. So I have a question about younger voters. I've seen a lot of my first and second generation American friends express that feeling that you had talked about earlier, that feeling of, you know, when you come of voting age, you're expected to fit into these boxes, but at the same time, your validity as an American citizen is challenged. And I was curious because you had also mentioned that the younger voters that you had spoken to, a lot of them identified as independents or expressed their distancing from certain parties. Have you seen younger voters express that feeling in a way that makes them seem, is it like discouraging to young voters, or have you seen them express it in a way where they go, no, I have a right to vote, it's the system that doesn't work for me, and kind of challenge the system as opposed to getting discouraged?
Yeah, I'll say that group I mentioned that is choosing to be independent or to go against the two-party system, numerically they're a tiny minority. It was like 5 out of the 100 people we spoke with. They tend to be people that are very, very politically engaged. So I wouldn't say that the majority of the young people are leaning independent or eschewing, you know, the party system. But I would say, you know, there are, and again, the quantitative data shows there's significant numbers, majority, I believe, of young Latino voters who are progressive or left-leaning, and they made a big difference in this election and other recent elections. On the ground, qualitatively, what I'm seeing is that those young people tend to be people that are college educated and or are activated politically through social media, through political organizations. I wouldn't say that it's kind of natural that every young Latino is more left-leaning and progressive. I would say, you know, those who, and specifically, it's like those who go to college, maybe a 4-year university, for instance. You know, we talked to others that were working class, maybe they were going to community college at the same time. Those folks sounded more like voters in their 30s and 40s, where in the sense that they were, you know, they had mixed views sort of across the political spectrum. So I think it also has to do with a kind of politicization, political awareness through education and or social media, political groups, etc.
You know, I wondered sometimes in hearing some of the discourse, whether a certain kind of partisanship is sort of elite, that it requires a certain level of education and kind of enculturation into that discourse, that talk, the way that people talk about politics in a certain way that makes for partisanship. And you know, I think that was a little bit reflected sometimes in some of the people we heard from, but also in the more public discourse in the media.
All right. Question from Mike Eng in Oregon, and then we're going to go to Margaret Kobos in Oklahoma. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, thanks very much. I wanted to ask you whether you thought open primaries would have the potential for engendering more participation by Latinos. You mentioned that they often don't see that their vote makes a difference. And it seems that if you were able to participate in an open primary early on, you would have a greater voice in choosing the final candidates on a ballot. And also you would have the ability, as you mentioned, that oftentimes Latino voters vote across the political spectrum. If they were voting for individuals in an open primary, perhaps that could also motivate them to be more engaged, not have to have such a party affiliation, but could vote more on the issues. The candidates themselves would have more motivation to engage with voters across the spectrum and speak to issues of importance to all voters because they need to get past that primary into the final election. I just want to get your thoughts on what role you think open primaries could play in engaging Latinos. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I just became aware of this organization. John reached out to us. He read our report, and I personally, you know, we're just moving into political research with this study, and I wasn't aware of this debate. And so I can't, you know, I don't want to go beyond sort of my scope and be able to say what the effect would be of having open primaries, because that's not something that we ask people about. But if you know, what you have seen is that kind of election would somehow lead candidates to address more people, or to address them in a way that wasn't so bifurcated, you know, perhaps that would engender more of a conversation. I will say that as far as the Latinos who are not voting, because the ones that we described as very hybrid, you know, or we're talking about people who are voting already, but they've got these mixed views. The folks who are not voting, it's a bigger issue than whether the election is partisan or not, you know. And just like this anecdote really stuck with me. One of the non-voters we spoke with, he desired to feel like he was part of something bigger, but he wanted to be convinced that his vote was going to make a difference. And he told me, like, well into the conversation that somehow came up, he told me that a couple times he'd actually driven to the polling site and then didn't get off his car, and he drove away. And he couldn't explain explicitly what it was, right? So it wasn't apathy, he was there. And was it that he didn't feel like it was something that was for him to do? He felt out of place. The only way he could explain it was, I want you to convince me that my vote is going to make a difference. So in terms of just getting people to the polls, you know, that's a bigger challenge that we have to work on. And I suggest reading the report. We have what we outline as 3 different pillars that we have to work on to improve civic engagement. That has to do with a sense of empowerment and belonging in society in general, with developing voting habits, and then with pushing for a political system that's actually speaking to you and to people like you. Otherwise, you won't feel that you have a stake in it.
Before we move on to Margaret's question, Danny, did you want to respond to Mike? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I'm thank you for asking that. I think it's a matter of removing layers. And though I agreed with Cecilia, it's a matter of removing layers. And when I say we don't vote because we're not contacted, that's just one aspect of it. It's much deeper than that. But I think that if more people would vote in primaries, that cultural voting, that civic participation would increase. Because in Arizona, independents are not contacted, doesn't matter whether you're Latino or not, are not contacted to get out and vote. Okay. And so it's a matter of just doing it over and over and watching and your kids watching you do it over and over. And if you're an independent and you're not contacted, you don't do it at all. And so I think it's a matter of removing obstacles or removing layers that keep people from voting. Much like Cecilia said, tell me that it's going to matter. That's just another layer. Okay. And so, and direct answer to the question is, look, if we had open primaries, then you'd have candidates and primaries contacting independent voters. Right now, they don't exist. Politicians don't care, and they don't have the money or raise the money to be able to reach out to independents because they don't matter. I came back to Cecilia's point, right? Independents don't matter to the primaries. And aside from the fact that people feel they don't matter, you actually tell them that because you never contact them.
Right. That's very helpful. Margaret, go ahead with your question. You're in Oklahoma. You're in Oklahoma, right?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm in Tulsa. And I wanted to thank both Danny and Cecilia. They made some comments about early on about kind of getting to the deeper issues of why people are not voting, especially Latinos, and the sense of, they didn't feel like they were getting anything from their politicians, and kind of the issue of a breakdown of a social contract, which I think is a really important point that goes across every demographic. And I'm having a lot of conversations, and I have no political history until this year. And so I'm just now starting to have these conversations and opening doors and making phone calls. And I can tell you the same things that Cecilia was saying are echoed by everyone I talk to. And in the end, we always get to something we agree on. We always get to, the same frustrations and concerns. These labels that are put on everyone by parties seem maybe antiquated or static. And I feel like a lot of people, not just Latinos, share the same frustration. So I guess my question is, really kind of sociologically, do we think that it's possible that the evolution of the internet and the ability of people to associate and get information independently has kind of spelled maybe the demise or the disconnect of citizens from the parties? So, back in the day, like in the 30s or 40s, you relied on your party to kind of give you information and tell you what to do and tell you what the issues were. And now we don't have that. And I really think we see as a change happening in terms of political parties, maybe like we saw in labor unions, as kind of they went out of favor, and maybe now they're coming kind of back, but evolved. Do we have any thoughts on that, Cecilia?
Wow. I don't offhand. Michael, does anything come to mind for you about the subject?
Yeah, one of the theories out there about partisanship is that it's good for civic engagement. That was one of the theories that we had heard. I don't know that we found that to be true, but it's kind of a theory out there. And so, I think what we discovered was that there are potentially multiple pathways to civic engagement, that association with the political party could be a type of civic engagement, in that, you get really excited about rooting for your candidate and your party. I think that there are ways that internet could potentially improve civic engagement. But I think what we were finding, the most interesting things that were happening were around how community could, different forms of community could promote civic engagement and that there's a lot of institutions out there, social institutions, that are kind of, for better, not doing their job in promoting civic engagement, that schools could do more, religious groups. And there's so many different kinds of community and social forms that are happening. We're so focused on the individual and the individual voter that I think maybe we're neglecting all these other potential avenues for civic engagement in the community.
That's great.
Thank you.
Hey, we've run out of time. I know we could keep going for another hour, but this is our allotted time. Before I wrap it up, Danny, do you have a few words you want to say, and then we'll wrap it up here?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I've dealt with over the years was just, trying to make it simple. Register another voter, make sure they get out to vote, and make sure again and again. Because at the end of the day, it's that repetitiveness, it's that modeling, it's that sense of belonging that I think that we need, not to mention that we make a difference, right? It's all connected to that. And so we can dig real deep, and I think we need to, but you can make it simple by simply registering people to vote and making sure they get out to vote. A different person every time, once that person gets it. And more importantly, that we ought to remove layers. Independents should be allowed to vote in primaries. And as it relates to the Latino community, that's the only way we're going to continue to build that culture of voting.
Amen. Well, thank you, Michael and Cecilia. This is really a great conversation and the end of our summer virtual Zoom discussion series. We're going to resume this fall. A couple quick things. Everybody on the Zoom today will be receiving a follow-up email with a copy of Cecilia and Michael's report. I want to really encourage everybody to read it cover to cover and to share it in your networks. Get this out, start the conversation. It is a really great and extremely accessible conversational report. It's not dry academics. It brings you into an intimate conversation with Latino voters in Texas. I know Cecilia and Michael are interested in doing other research projects with Latino voters, with independent voters, with other communities. And I think this intimate conversational research approach is completely connected to all of our efforts to restructure the political process and political system so it can be more intimate and community-based and empowering for people that don't fit into neat boxes. So I want to, in some ways, deputize all of us to help get Michael and Cecilia out into the reform conversation, the research conversation, because their work is so valuable. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cecilia and Danny and Michael, and have a great summer, everyone. We'll see you in the fall.
Thank you. Thank you.